Is HP and defense being over or undervalued? Now, I feel like this is a pretty loaded question, and I want to kind of break this down in multiple different perspectives. Now, I will say first and foremost that running HP and defense is very much so subjective to each player, how well you can play. Are you going for sustain? Are you going for more DPS? And just kind of understanding the variances of this and what might happen within the builds of your characters. Now, with that understanding being fleshed out, I think it's important to understand that from the very beginning of the game, just having increased HP or increased defense and then stacking that with like a spear and shield or battle of stamina, that was just kind of like the thing to do. Like everybody's like, oh, you got to have all the sustain. But now that the game is starting to develop more, you're starting to see more builds where people are going or emphasizing more for glass cannon builds, and they're trying to scale the DPS as far as they possibly can. But does that mean that those builds are viable? And I guess that can really honestly be answered based off of what kind of player or what type of player you are. So if we're just looking at the average player, right? And let's say hypothetically you're running about 3K HP, 10K, 50 to 15K defense. Is that a viable build? Depending on what you're doing, probably not. And the reason why that is because even if it's a bunny, there's going to be an instance where you might get to like wave 10 of, say, like a Kuiper farm or something like that. And ad is going to hit you for almost 3K or more, and you're probably almost going to die, or if not die, right? So it's like certain situations, it's not going to be the best thing to have that low value. And then it's also about the locking in aspect of it, right? So every single time you make a decision to, say, not go with something and with something else, you're, like I mentioned in the last video, you're potentially locking in something, right? And I feel like all in all, one of the best things for players that are just kind of, easing their way into the game, they're casually playing, the best thing you can do is to try to keep certain values as neutral as possible. Now, to also tackle the idea of if HP and defense are just being overvalued or undervalued, I think that HP and defense is being overvalued in certain aspects as far as the base modules, right? But I feel like the modules that are giving you the extra are being undervalued because people don't actually understand what they are doing. So it's like, for example, if we take like the spear and shield, right? We normally could say, for example, go with increased defense. Increased defense at max is going to give you 160% more defense, right? But then you have things like spear and shield. Now you can do one of two things where you can either stack this with increased defense, or you can just use spear and shield, right? Or you can just use increased defense. It's like really depends on the scenario. But let's say we're just going for the spear and shield like in this build. What is the benefit to using a shield or spear and shield or defense mod that technically has way lower, almost half of the value that the increased defense is giving? Well, it's not only just giving me defense, but it's also giving me skill power of plus 8.1%. Now, again, I constantly try to remind you guys that these values are extremely potent. When you're looking at a skill power value of 8.1%, that is a lot that you are adding to the very beginning of the equation, right? This isn't like a multiplier that happens after the fact. This is something that now is going to be transpiring in the very beginning. So what we're having happen is that these values are being extremely underrated, and we're starting to see more builds that are now emphasizing these things for the sacrificing of some of those, like, say, bulkier modules. And it's because ultimately, if you're trying to, say, one-shot something, you might not need to necessarily have 160% defense because you're one-shotting something, right? Even down to modules such as the Glacial Sanctum, right? This is something like there's actually a mod for, I think, just about every single attribute for this, which is a critical hit resistance of 15.1%. And then the attribute skill power increase of 10.2%. Now, again, people are looking at this mod as, oh, this doesn't add up or equal anything. But this mod is literally the finishing piece to giving people some of the higher scaling numbers that they're actually getting in these builds. And so that's one of the things that I feel like is starting to kind of come to the forefront more, is that you're seeing that even though, right, the first thing is like critical hit resistance. Why would I care for that, right? But it's also giving you the chill skill power. And I think also, too, it's also underrated when you're looking at the critical hit resistance. I feel like as the game develops, and even as you start to get into harder content, being able to have less damage being applied to you, you have to factor in like what is actually happening. You're not just looking at like your HP pool defense, but you're going to have to start considering resistances, right? That's going to be a huge thing as we get deeper into the game. And as the mechanics and gimmicks and the fights get longer, you're going to have to start considering those things. And even to the concept of people one-shotting and is though, should you as a player be aiming for those builds? I think that again, this is going to be a thing that's starting to kind of have you rubber banding. And when you're starting to look at going and committing with a build, builds are just constantly evolving and constantly changing. And as an average player, you're not going to be able to realistically keep up with every single change, because keep in mind, this is going to have you resocketing every single time there's some sort of adjustment or some sort of shift. And that's not realistically tangible for players that are maybe playing free to play. And you're trying to finish a character to maybe move on to another character, or you're still not even halfway done with a character, right? So I would say to get the most out of your character, you still want to run these values, even if you're not hitting the highest damage numbers, right? Because I think that, yes, the min-maxing is amazing. I love min-maxing personally, but I also have to consider, is this something that is tangible for the average player to be able to accomplish within set amount of time? And so I had to think about things such as purchasing power or buying power, as well as time invested. And when you're looking at these values, if you actually understand that you can still have a very much so complete and very, very much so, I would say able to accomplish Descendant, they don't necessarily have to be at that peak point for you to be able to do that. Now, the analogy that I use, because the space I come from, we have something like we have turn-based games where like if like, for example, say the average amongst the players was you can clear a dungeon in 4 minutes, but then the min-maxing or a new unit comes out that allows you to be able to clear it in 2 minutes. That is just a matter of that shedding of 2 minutes and if that time matters to you. But if you're already clearing it, in all honesty, a clear is a clear. So yeah, if you're, say for example, hitting 20 mil but not hitting the 60 something or 40 something mil, you're still doing well, right? And so I think that when you're looking at these values and as you continue to build your characters, you have to also understand what works for you, right? Because some people might need that extra cushion so that they're able to sustain and get through a fight, whereas others might not. They might have more prowess and capability of dodging, whereas others might not. I think it's also important to also mention too that mechanically, some of these builds are not going to and aren't meant for longer term fights, period. Because there is certain aggroing, whether you want to admit it or not, where you're fighting certain bosses and they'll aggro you and all it takes is for them to turn around real quick and you're dead, or there's ads still shooting at you. And so if we're already not emphasizing values such as shield, you then have to then be aware of the fact that you still need to have some sustain for that HP and defense value. So again, I wanted to make this video so that you guys understood that there is a lot of value in these, what you would consider less value in terms of the raw stat that you might be looking for, whether it be the defense or the HP, but it's also giving you something else in conjunction, or something like, for example, a lot of people probably aren't using critical hit resistance with the chill skill power or the other powers, right? Like it just all is something that's going to help you scale. And I think that even when you're looking at the negatives, right, the positive with a negative, you can counteract all of those. So you have to factor those into your builds. But all in all, again, if you are deciding that you don't want to run HP and defense, do be aware that that's for very, very specific content, right? A lot of the times, normally, you're going to want those values so that you're able to sustain yourself and to be able to get through that content. So that would be my answer to those of you guys that have been asking that question. I hope that that was able to kind of give you some insight. Whatever you do decide to do, make sure it fits into your preference and play style. So that's basically going to be that, guys. Everyone, stay blessed, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.